What's going on, guys? Today is the day we address the elephant in the room, considerably one of the most broken cards in all of H.A.T format. One of the reasons why so many players won't even give H.A.T format a chance, and that card is going to be Soul Charge. And this card, to say this is the #1 spot in a format that has Maxi, Vanity's Emptiness, Skill Drain all at 3 can definitely say a lot. And if you've experienced this card, you know exactly why this card is so powerful. And if you've never experienced this, you've probably heard of this card. And today I wanted to go over what this card is, why it's such a notorious card, and talk about if it actually is as broken as people say into H.A.T format and even into modern Yu-Gi-Oh! How this card could have implications. And my whole thing with this is just trying to get people to understand H.A.T format a little more and some of the cards that you may or may not be seeing, and see if people's, reactions to some of these considered broken cards is actually justified, and just in general, maybe even to debunk some of these myths so that more people will give it a chance, because I genuinely believe that H.A.T format is such a great and diverse format, and more people should definitely give it a chance. With all of that being said, I did recently do a video on Vanity's Emptiness that's going to be extremely similar to that video, so if you haven't checked that video out, I will have it linked in the description. You can either pause this video and go and check that out, or after this video, go and check that out, as Vanity's Emptiness is a card that, again, a lot of people also consider to be one of the most broken floodgatey type cards, and is a reason that a lot of people don't give H.A.T a chance, as I mentioned prior, but we definitely somewhat debunk that myth a little bit in that video, so definitely give that a watch. With that being said, Soul Charge was a card released in Dragons of Legend as a super rare. Dragons of Legend was the same set that introduced, Fire and Ice Hand, as well as a lot of other very powerful cards. Soul Charge says, target any number of monsters in your graveyard, special summon them, and if you do, lose 1,000 life points for each monster special summoned by this effect. You cannot conduct your battle phase the turn you activate this card, and you can only activate 1 Soul Charge per turn. Now, obviously, it should be pretty easy to tell why Soul Charge is such a great card. Being able to pay life points to bring back basically as many monsters from your graveyard as possible for just 1,000 life points each, and you have to keep in mind that while 1,000 life points each might sound like a crazy number to pay for, just 1 special summon, what makes this card so good is think of how easy it is to get cards in the graveyard. You could just get so many things into the graveyard, especially take, for example, H.A.T format that has cards like Lavalval Chain that can be extremely easy to access and just mill whatever you basically want, or just in general, all of the combo decks and things available in H.A.T format that can basically just set up a huge graveyard and be able to go and summon all of that back, basically for free, as your life points are pretty much just a resource, and the only one that really matters is going to be your last life point. And let's not forget that even when you're summoning a lot of monsters, think into modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, sometimes that is enough just to make a basically unbreakable board that your opponent won't have a way to answer, and for what? Just some life points that, again, it's just another resource. So think into modern Yu-Gi-Oh! For example, say you were playing your combo deck going off and you get hit with Nibiru. A lot of times that will just stop your turn in its tracks. Sometimes, there's decks that can put up Omni Negates or different ways to play through Nibiru a little bit, but it's definitely not as powerful as what it could have been had you not been hit with Nibiru. So now take, for example, you get hit with that, and then you can go, for example, in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Into Triple Tactics Thrust into Soul Charge, and now basically the Nibiru did nothing, and you can keep comboing off. If anything, you just got a free token to actually go and link with, which can potentially make your boards even better. Not to mention, the downside of not being able to conduct your battle phase isn't really the biggest thing when this card can still be activated on turn 1 when you don't even have a battle phase. Now, obviously, this is all wishful thinking, but it's actually a lot more common to come up than you might expect. So let's take a second to look at some of the decks that really take advantage of Soul Charge in Hat format. Most commonly known, Soul Charge and Lonefire Blossom is a crazy way to actually go and, take advantage of Soul Charge. Lonefire being able to tribute itself, summon another copy of Lonefire Blossom, and then Lonefire into, say, something like a Sylvan Hermitry, and then you can Soul Charge the two Lonefires back and basically just go from there. The Sylvans being very strong, big monsters that can go and take advantage of powerful extra deck monsters, for example, like Divine Dragon Knight Felgran, which is basically a quick effect monster negate or make a monster unaffected by card effects, which is very, very strong. You have the Dragon Rulers, which, even though they're all at one, obviously the ruler decks take great advantage of the graveyard, being able to send tons of cards to the graveyard with cards, for example, like Card Trooper. We have cards like Dragon Shrine, which is basically a double Foolish Burial for dragon monsters. You have cards just like Foolish Burial in general. You have the Lightsworn monsters, which are known for milling cards from the deck to the graveyard. And again, you have other variants of rulers. So here's Lightsworn Ruler, you have Mythic Ruler, you have Hieratic Ruler, which basically can summon normal monsters from your deck whenever they're tributed, which then you can make an Xyz, detach, summon another card, and then you have more fuel in your graveyard in order to use Soul Charge and just make an even bigger board. Decks like Mermail, which can play a grindy control game, or if they really want to just create a big board, being able to put up something like an Abyss Gaios, a Draco Sack, a Big Eye, plenty of different rank 3s, 4s, even synchro plays. It's a great deck for that. Infernity is a very good example of a combo deck that really takes advantage of Soul Charge, being able to just empty your hand, get a lot of resources into graveyard, and if you get stopped at any point, Soul Charge basically will just get you back in the game. And Infernity is another deck that scares off a lot of players from actually playing Hat format, despite its kind of lack of representation at times, but being able to be one of the decks that has Interruption and an Omni Negate in cards such as Infernity Barrier, as well as Interruption in Infernity Break and other things. Soul Charge is just a great way to take advantage of that. And so, as you can kind of see, Soul Charge primarily gets its focus in combo decks, but that doesn't mean that some of the slower decks can't take advantage of that. For example, artifacts, if you have two artifacts in graveyard, then you can Soul Charge them back and go into powerful Xyz such as Constellar Pleiades. You have the hands, which basically when they're destroyed by opponents' cards and sent to the graveyard, you special summon the opposite one, so Ice Hand floats into Fire Hand, as well as they have other effects. For example, Ice Hand will pop an opponent's spell or trap, Fire Hand will pop an opponent's monster, and so basically you're able to crash these into your opponent's board, break their board, and on the following turn, you've now filled your graveyard. And if you go for a Soul Charge play, you can make some of those extremely powerful rank 4 Xyz monsters, such as Abyss Dweller that is available in Hat format, as well as things like Exciton, 101, and so many other things. Even decks like Geargia that are known to be slower control decks can take advantage of Soul Charge just because there are ways to actually get rid of, some of your resources and get them back in order to make bigger pushes, especially if they get stopped partially through. It's kind of just a comeback card, and a good example even here is like Lonefire Blossom and Geargia Arsenal, cards that tribute for cost. So say you summon these and your opponent, say, uses a breakthrough skill, for example, so the effect is negated, you can still tribute these for cost. And while you won't get the summon off of them, you can then Soul Charge, bring them back, and go from there, which is very, very powerful. Just being able to really extend your plays, and it just kind of shows why it's such a great card. Really quickly, here's just a couple examples of some of the decks that are taking advantage of Soul Charge so you can get an idea of how some of these lists look. So here is a first place Hieratic ruler list that recently won an event, and as you see, lots of big monsters, the dragon rulers, you see triple soul charge here, and soul charge can be really crazy, especially backed up with cards like skill drain, because if you can summon some of these big bodies or even go into some of these big synchros, for example, like Star Eater or even Stardust, Stardust Spark, just to name a few examples, and then back it up with skill drain, it's very, very hard to play through something like that. Here we have Lightsworn Ruler, another deck that I mentioned that can just get its graveyard very quickly, and being able to make a big soul charge play turn one, say you mill a lot of cards with your card trooper, it can just get you so deep into your deck that you can gain so much advantage, and it's really hard for an opponent to come back from that. Here we have Geargia Karakuri, a deck that can play somewhat slow, but it can also really combo off with the Karakuri engine, and sometimes if you really want to just put up that big board and get a lot of advantage, Soul Charge is even in a deck like this. Here we have Infernity, again, a card or a deck that's extremely powerful and really takes good advantage of Soul Charge, backed up with even cards like Vanity's Emptiness. It can be very hard to break a board like that, and it's also allowed a lot of rogue decks. Here is a Fabled Raccoon deck that isn't the most popular, but this was actually able to get second place in an online hat format tournament, and I would say part of that could potentially be because of Soul Charge being such a good card, as well as the cards it actually enables you to go and make. Now, despite this card being so prevalent and such a powerful card, it might surprise you guys to know that while Soul Charge is such a powerful card, it's actually not seen as much in every single deck. There's definitely plenty of decks, top decks in hat format, that win or top events that play 0 to maybe 1 or 2 copies of Soul Charge. So why is it that if a card is so good, it's not in every single list? So to give you guys an example, here is a second place Bujin list that, as you can see, plays 0 copies of Soul Charge in the main or side. Here we have a Madolche deck, again, not playing any copies of Soul Charge. Here we have a rogue option, a spirit deck that, again, 0 copies of Soul Charge, and this has got first place at a online hat format tournament. Here we have another top list. As you see, only 1 copy of Soul Charge in the deck, and it's Geargia, as I mentioned, a deck that can technically take advantage of it. And same with playing the hands, cards that, again, can help fuel your graveyard pretty easily, and then you can go and get a Soul Charge off. We have decks like Spellbook, again, another very powerful deck. This one also got second place at an online hat format tournament and no copies of Soul Charge. And lastly, here is another example of a H.A.T artifact deck that topped a online hat format tournament, and you see 0 copies of Soul Charge in the main or side. So what all those decks have in common is they are kind of the slower, grindier decks of the format, or more so ramp decks that might take a little bit longer to actually set up, as well as they don't really need the Soul Charge because of how their gameplay actually is. Take, for example, Spellbook. It's a deck that usually doesn't play the most monsters, and even then, you really just need one to start going off and applying pressure. Or take, for example, a deck like Bujin's. It's a deck that usually uses 1 normal summon. A lot of their monsters don't even allow you to have multiple of the same names on board, as well as they have their own kind of built-in type of Soul Charge in Bujin Carnation, which allows them to pretty much summon 2 of their monsters back from the grave or banishment. You have decks like Madolche that have cards like H.A.T that basically can just summon monsters from deck, and with the powerful Xyz in Leviair and cards like Invoker can actually do a lot of comboing with their own engine, and they don't need need to be able to use Soul Charge. So the cool thing about Hat format is it is a very diverse format, as I mentioned prior, and it really kind of shows with a card like Soul Charge where, despite it being such a broken card, not everything needs to play it, and just because you're not playing it doesn't mean that you can't top events. But there are a handful of other things that Soul Charge kind of is weaker to, and so let's quickly go and talk about those. You have DD Crow and Max C, two cards that put Soul Charge in kind of an awkward position because these are so represented. As you might have seen in those lists, most decks are maining or siding all the combinations of these. Say your opponent goes for a Soul Charge play and you drop a Max C on them, they can go and it's all considered one summon, but you will get one draw out of it. But say they wanted to use that stuff to combo off, as I mentioned prior. Here you can go, and then if they want to actually make that full board, you're going to get multiple draws, and sometimes, while I said it is hard to break those boards that Soul Charge can make, it's a lot easier to do when you have tons of cards in hand, and say you're playing one of those combo decks too, or just a deck that can be very trap heavy and grindy. You can easily play through some of those boards, given you have, 5, 6 plus cards, because your opponent wanted to fully combo off, and they have no battle phase, so you have a turn minimally to do that, which also will leave the opponent at quite a lower life point total, which means that it can be slightly easier to actually go and beat them through their big board. Not to mention DD Crow, say they target just 1 or 2 monsters or even a bunch of them, you can use DD Crow and get rid of one of the cards that might be telegraphed as one of the cards they really need for their combo, or even if they just go for 1 or 2, sometimes using a DD Crow on one of the targets is extremely strong. Obviously, they won't pay the life for the one that gets banished, but sometimes that's enough to just damper their whole combo, and so the hand traps definitely put in a lot of work. The next big threat to Soul Charge being extremely viable in certain situations are the staple one-ofs in the format. So for example, Solemn Warning, Torrential Tribute, Bottomless Trap Hole, and Dark Hole. So for example, say your opponent goes and activates a Soul Charge. You have the chance of activating Solemn Warning to stop it. Now again, it's not great to use this as an example because it is a one-of, but it definitely puts your opponent in a certain situation where if there's multiple back row, they do have to be somewhat weary of, if there is a warning back there, you might just be shut out of the turn. Obviously, if you have a second copy of Soul Charge, you can go and use that after the warning, because warning does go and negates the activation. So you will be able to activate another, but even then, it kind of puts your opponent in a position where if they use it too early, it puts them too low on life. Or if they use it too late, maybe they don't have enough life points to actually go and put up the biggest board, because, there's a lot of small chip damage in this format, meaning that even the smallest attack can basically shut down one of the monster summons off of a Soul Charge. Hopefully that's making sense. Another situation, your opponent goes for a big Soul Charge play, and your opponent could torrential the board, and then they paid all of that life for nothing. You have cards like Bottomless, maybe they go for some of those bigger monsters, and Bottomless will go and banish all of the ones with 1500 or more attack. So against, like, say, Sylvans, if they're going for a lot of those bigger trees, they can all get wiped off the board. You also have situations where if you put up a decent board, maybe paired with something like a Maxi or a DD Crow, that maybe you're incentivized not to go for the biggest board, or you get stopped again with something like DD Crow and you can't put up the biggest board. If your opponent has the Dark Hole on the crackback, they can just basically break your whole board, and again, you paid all that life points for almost nothing. And there's a lot of kind of blowout Xyz as well. So for example, Heartland Draco is a card that sees a lot more play in modern Hat format than it did in the past. And this card basically, once per turn, you can detach a material from this card. This turn, this card can attack your opponent directly, but other monsters can't attack. If your opponent activates the Soul Charge and uses up too much life points, a lot of times you can just steal a game with a card like Heartland Draco attacking for 2000, Or again, if your opponent's already pretty low on life and then they have to use the soul charge to try to get back in the game, sometimes they can get blown out by this card. Same with Gaga Cowboy, being able to inflict some damage without even needing to attack. Also, similar to Torrential or Dark Hole in a sense, if your opponent goes for a big soul charge play, if their cards outnumber yours, sometimes H.A.T can just clean up a board state. So it really kind of puts your opponent in an interesting spot where do they want to go and use their soul charge early and risk, not having it later on in the game? Or are they going to go and use it later in the game, but risk the chance of not being able to get full advantage out of it? And so with the different traps and other things, many of which aren't even shown here, it can be a little risky to go for a soul charge play. Lastly, we do have a lot of other cards that kind of make soul charge put into a very strange position. So starting off, I guess I'll talk about the artifacts. So artifacts have a very powerful card, another broken card, I guess you could call it, where we have Artifact Scythe, which is a card that's even banned into modern Yu-Gi-Oh! As well. And this card basically, when it's special summoned during the opponent's turn, monsters can't be summoned from the extra deck for the rest of the turn. So if your opponent does plan to go for a big soul charge play and your opponent flips a Artifact Sanctum and summons a Scythe, that can really stop your opponent. And then again, paired with something like Dark Hole or just your own big push of monsters, you can easily break their board. You have cards like Artifact Ignition, which if your opponent pops this card, basically if this card in the owner's possession is destroyed by an opponent's card, your opponent skips their next battle phase, meaning if they pair something with, like say they popped in Ignition and then they try to use a soul charge, this will carry over, so now they're skipping basically 2 battle phases, which definitely gives the opponent a lot of chances to try to get back into the game. We also do have Vanity's Emptiness, as I mentioned prior, which again, you should check out that video if you haven't already. Vanity's Emptiness says neither player can special summon monsters. So basically, if your opponent goes soul charge and you see their targets and you think that is a threat, maybe you don't have a hand trap, but you have this set, you can flip this, and if they don't have the out, the soul charge will just resolve with no effect. So you have so many different ways to actually put your opponent in a somewhat weird situation with activating their soul charge, or take advantage of the fact that they do. Again, even stuff like the hands can really just clear through your opponent's monsters and board and do enough chip damage to leave your opponent at an awkward amount of life where soul charge won't get the biggest effect. Also, cards like Upstart Goblin, which a lot of people play in order to go and actually make their deck more consistent, can conflict with soul charge, because if you activate Upstart Goblin, sure, you'll draw a card, but your opponent will gain 1,000 life points, which in a way gives your opponent an extra activation of soul charge, which can mean that some decks are going to play slightly less consistent because they don't want to risk getting blown out by a soul charge, which kind of shows why it is a powerful card. And don't get me wrong, it is extremely prevalent, but it's definitely not in every single deck. And I feel that it is a lot of more so trauma from a card like this because it did make so many decks viable and made for a big change in the game. But now that we've had time to look back at the 2014 H.A.T format, you can see that while this card does have its moments, it also isn't quite as crazy of a card, at least in my opinion and many others, but it definitely is a card that's extremely prevalent in the format. But anyways, guys, hopefully you understood what I'm trying to get at with this video, and let me know what you think of Soul Charge, whether you're currently playing H.A.T format or in the past you've played it and you haven't wanted to look back at it. I really think that H.A.T format has a chance to be one of the top retro formats, more so than it is now, and gain more recognition because there are so many of these cards that people just think are way over the top, but in a weird way almost feel slightly balanced with how the format is. It's very similar to how every format kind of has its broken cards. For example, Edison having things like Royal Oppression, or even cards like Trap Dushoot, there's Heavy Storm, and just all these cards that people really don't like in the formats. And so obviously Hat format has its broken cards, but in a way they're just making for more intricate gameplay and ways to interact with the opponent. And unlike those formats, Hat format has so many different ways to play into different types of broken cards like that, because it is a much slower format than, say, modern Yu-Gi-Oh! In a way. But anyways, like I said, let me know what you think of this, and if you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like on it, comment any questions or videos you want to see in the future, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell to get notified anytime I put a new video out, share this video with your friends, maybe if they were afraid to give Hat a chance, this can kind of help convince them, and if there's any other cards that kind of scare you from playing Hat, comment them in the comment section, and maybe I'll make a video on that. Or for example, decks or anything like that that you think are way too overpowered, I'd love to make a discussion on those as well, as I know that Infernity, for example, is a deck that scare off a lot of people, but as I mentioned, it's not quite as prevalent as you might think. But anyways, guys, I will see you in the next video.